The gears of war turn relentlessly. But, sometimes they seize up. And if you were paying close attention in the summer of 1943, you could hear that unmistakable sound of the German war machine just grinding to a decisive halt.
That sound you're describing, it wasn't just in one place either. It was a global strategic shift. We're looking today at a really pivotal 90-day period from July to September 1943, where the Allies went from just, winning battles to fundamentally changing the entire strategic initiative of World War II. Our sources detail these as the tentative but very positive steps toward victory.
Okay, let's really unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into a time when German military supremacy, which had terrorized Europe for 4 years, was finally, and I mean definitively, faltering. But this confidence, it wasn't sudden, was it? It was built on some massive psychological and logistical victories.
Exactly. You have to establish the context leading into July 1943. While Stalingrad, back in February, had been an unimaginable human disaster for the Nazis on the Eastern Front, the Western Allies had already achieved 3 critical successes. And these really made the following operations possible. First, the tide had turned irrevocably in the Battle of the Atlantic.
And that operational victory at sea was it was everything. The anti-U-boat measures they agree on at the Casablanca Conference in January were finally having a crippling effect. We often talk about battles won on land, but securing those North Atlantic sea lanes was the critical operational lubricant for everything that followed.
It was a brutal attrition rate for the U-boats. I mean, the Allies were sinking submarines faster than the Germans could even produce them. Grand Admiral Dönitz, he basically had to admit defeat and withdraw the U-boats from the main North Atlantic convoy routes entirely. The sheer loss of experienced crews and the plummeting morale meant the threat was contained. That allowed for massive troop and supply movements across the ocean, pretty much unopposed.
So with the shipping secure, the Allies could then turn up the pressure from above. Operation Point Blank, the round-the-clock bombing campaign, was fully underway.
And this was just unrelenting strategic pressure. The USAF was using precision bombing by day, targeting German infrastructure, industrial sites, oil refineries.
And RAF by night.
And the RAF continued their area bombing strategy by night. It ensured that every German citizen felt the constant degrading pressure of total war. This campaign was crucial not just for physical damage, but for tying up vast amounts of German resources like anti-aircraft batteries, fighter planes, and manpower that were desperately needed somewhere else.
Particularly on the Eastern Front.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, you had the conclusion of the North Africa campaign in mid-May 1943. This is a point that I think often gets overshadowed by later events, but the surrender of the Axis in Tunisia was just shocking in its scale.
Our sources really emphasize this. They say it was a strategic catastrophe for the Axis that, in some ways, exceeded the psychological blow of Stalingrad.
It did. The Allies captured nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia. Now, at Stalingrad, while the casualty figures were horrific, the forces were mostly cut off and destroyed in place. In Tunisia, an entire army group surrendered. This military validation showed that the Allies could coordinate these incredibly complex amphibious invasions and massive ground campaigns. It boosted confidence immensely for what was coming next.
So, with the war at sea won, the air war ramped up, and North Africa secured, the Allied High Command meets in Washington, D.C. for the Trident Conference. That was in May of '43. They reaffirmed the foundational Hitler First policy, acknowledging Germany was still the primary threat. And they agreed the next immediate step had to be the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. But that's where the consensus ended, right? This conference, in many ways, set the stage for the dramatic clashes we were about to see in the field.
Oh, absolutely. What's so fascinating here is how fundamentally different the Americans and the British viewed the pathway to victory after Sicily. For the U.S. Chiefs of Staff, led by figures like General George C. Marshall, the goal was singularly focused. A rapid, massive invasion of northern France Operation Overlords to crush the German military quickly.
Marshall's primary concern wasn't just speed, though. It was about relief for the Soviet Union, correct?
Precisely. Marshall and the others had this deep, enduring geopolitical fear. They worried that if the Western Allies just kept dribbling resources into the Mediterranean, delaying the main invasion,
that Stalin might cut a deal.
They worried that the Soviet Red Army might become so exhausted or feel so abandoned that Stalin might just revive the ghosts of the August 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact and cut a separate peace deal with Hitler. That would be catastrophic. The U.S. wanted an immediate, decisive blow in the West to secure an unconditional victory and guarantee Russia stayed in the fight against Germany.
But the UK position, which was really led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was rooted in the traumatic memory of World War I trench warfare.
Churchill and General Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, they just fundamentally feared a premature cross-channel invasion. Their strategy was purely peripheral, the soft underbelly approach. Knock Italy out of the war, maybe continue striking at the Balkans or Greece. Their argument was that this would wear down German forces, force them to dissipate their reserves across a vast Mediterranean theater, and only then would Overlord, whenever it finally happened, be guaranteed success without the astronomical casualties of the Somme or Passchendaele.
It was a very real strategic clash. You have Churchill seeing Marshall's plan as a potential bloodbath, while Marshall sees Churchill's plan as this dangerous, resource-sucking diversion that's just delaying the end of the war.
And you have to remember the tremendous internal pressure Eisenhower was under. Marshall, who was Eisenhower's mentor, was constantly stressing the need to preserve resources for overlords. And at the same time, he had to counter demands from the Pacific Theater. General MacArthur was persistently demanding more landing craft, more resources to push the fight against Japan.
So Eisenhower had to walk this tightrope.
A very thin tightrope.
Yeah.
He had to agree to the May 1st, 1944 date for overlords, while simultaneously accepting the immediate necessity of Husky. He only agreed that if Husky was successful, the Allies would then assess the possibilities of moving on to the Italian mainland, which was really a grudging concession to Churchill.
And that concession, that compromise made it Trident. It sets up the stakes for everything that follows. We have the U.S. pushing for a quick frontal strike, and the U.K. demanding the bleeding of the Axis through Italy. Our mission here, in this deep dive, is to dissect how these tentative steps taken between July and September 1943, the invasion of Sicily and the political collapse in Rome, didn't just create a foothold in Europe, but fundamentally resolved this strategic impasse and changed the entire war, most notably by impacting that colossal struggle on the Russian front.
It wasn't a diversion at all. It was a pivot point that forced Hitler's hand at the absolute critical moment.
Let's start with that opening move, Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. And we really have to begin this story not on the beaches, but in a laboratory of deception.
This is where the preparation for Husky delivered a victory that was arguably as significant as the landings themselves. We're talking about Operation Mincemeat, the intelligence masterstroke. Hitler was already deeply anxious, as our sources note. The loss of 8 divisions in Tunisia and the continuing drain of resources on the Eastern Front meant the Mediterranean was practically bare of German reserves.
And Field Marshal Kesselring, who was commanding the German forces in the south, he correctly argued that Sicily was the obvious target, right?
He did.
So how could the Allies possibly make Hitler ignore the obvious?
They created a fake identity, a decoy. In April of 1943, the body of a homeless man who had died of pneumonia in Britain was carefully dressed up as a Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He was given these highly realistic personal effects wallet contents, identification, even love letters to create a plausible backstory. And crucially, the body was carrying supposedly top-secret letters signed by senior officers.
And these documents didn't just suggest a landing somewhere else. They gave meticulous, believable detail about non-existent invasions.
They specified Sardinia and Greece as the intended targets. They even suggested that the impending Sicily invasion was just a feint, a cover for the real operations in the Balkans. The body was dropped off the coast of Spain, where the Spanish security forces, who were sympathetic to the Nazis, dutifully ensured the documents were passed straight to German intelligence.
And the German intelligence, the Abwehr, they analyzed the documents and they swallowed the deception hook, line, and sinker.
This is the genius of Mincemeat. It leveraged Hitler's existing paranoia. The Führer was always deeply worried about an invasion through the Balkans. He believed it would be a direct threat to his oil supplies. So despite Kesselring's correct assessments, Hitler disregarded them. He ordered a major German panzer division to Greece, a motorized division to Sardinia, and significantly, he diverted 2 elite parachute divisions to southern France, all away from the Sicilian beaches.
So a handful of fake documents led to the deliberate misallocation of maybe 5 critical German divisions. That gave the Allies the operational cushion they desperately needed.
Absolutely. When the invasion fleet finally sailed, the 500,000 Anglo-American force slated for Husky outnumbered the remaining Axis defenders, primarily 2 understrength Italian and German formations, by nearly 2-to-1. The intelligence victory made the military execution vastly simpler.
Let's talk about the sheer scale of that military execution, Operation Husky. It was the largest military operation the Allies had even attempted to date.
The magnitude is truly staggering, especially when you view it against the context of what comes later. The sheer volume of material and men involved was just immense. We're talking about 5 invasion fleets, a total of 3,400 vessels operating under Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham. A combined force of 8 British, Canadian, and American divisions were scheduled to land, with more to follow rapidly.
And how did that scale compare to D-Day?
It actually eclipses the initial stages of D-Day in terms of immediate manpower. More men landed on Sicily in the first 24 hours of Operation Husky, over 160,000 troops, than would land on the Normandy beaches in a comparable period the following year. It was a massive commitment of resources.
And it was also the highly dramatic debut of large-scale airborne warfare for the Western Allies.
Yes, this was the baptism of fire for the 1st British and the U.S. 82nd Airborne Divisions. Parachute and glider troops were dropped ahead of the main landings to seize key objectives, sow chaos, and disrupt Axis communication lines. This was a critical test run, though. Very fraught one.
Speaking of fraud, the command structure itself was a simmering source of tension. You had a General Sir Harold Alexander, the calm professional, in overall charge, but under him you had the 2 most volatile personalities in the Allied armies.
A psychological powder keg, really. You had General Montgomery, the meticulous victor of El Alamein, intensely focused on planning and minimal casualties. And then you had Lieutenant General George S. Patton, blood and guts, swashbuckling, aggressive, and just obsessed with speed and personal glory. These 2 are destined to clash over every inch of Sicilian soil.
And their operational roles only inflamed that rivalry. Patton's 7th Army was initially tasked with landing on the south coast, essentially functioning as a flank guard for Montgomery's 8th Army. Monty landed on the southeastern corner, targeting the main supply routes toward Messina.
And that role was designed, in part, because of lingering concerns within the British High Command about the operational experience of American troops in massive combat operations, even despite their successes in Tunisia. Patton was essentially told to block an Axis retreat while Monty made the glory dash. Patton took this as a deep, personal, and professional insult, which, provided the fuel for his later, highly aggressive actions. He was determined his American troops would prove their worth.
Despite all that internal friction, the invasion fleet approached Sicily virtually unopposed. Allied air superiority was total, forcing the remaining Axis air forces to withdraw to the mainland. The most immediate enemy was actually the environment.
The elements presented the first, terrifying challenge. A tremendous storm erupted on July 9th, the day before the invasion. Our sources describe the seasickness as debilitating. I mean, can you imagine being loaded onto a landing craft knowing you're heading into the largest invasion ever while simultaneously being violently ill for 24 hours?
Fortunately, the storm subsided just before the main assault at 2:45 a.m. on July 10th, but the high winds remained, and that caused havoc with the airborne drops.
The casualty rates for the airborne troops were high, and their dispersal was massive. Out of 134 British gliders, 47 of them actually landed in the sea, drowning many soldiers. But those that did land, even though they were scattered, they achieved a key psychological goal. They created enough chaos and confusion behind the coastal defenses that the Axis command just struggled to organize an effective response.
When the assault troops came ashore, the resistance they met was wildly uneven, which really reinforces how effective mincemeat was.
Oh, absolutely. On the British side, resistance was negligible. They faced 6 Italian coastal defense divisions, composed mainly of older Sicilian reservists who had, let's say, little desire to fight for Mussolini or see their homes ravaged by war. They surrendered almost immediately. Within hours, Monty had 4 divisions and heavy equipment ashore, meeting only minor skirmishes.
But the American experience under Patton was very, very different.
Patton's troops faced genuine immediate danger. Initially, they handled some Italian tank units, but then they ran smack into a battle group from the elite German Hermann Göring Panzer Division. This German formation was ruthless and experienced, and they immediately overran an American infantry battalion. This signaled the German intent to fight fiercely wherever they could.
And that intent materialized into a full-blown crisis on July 11th.
Exactly. General Guzzoni, the Italian commander, ordered a decisive counterattack. The Hermann Göring Division, reinforced by the Italian Livorno Division, was tasked with driving the Americans straight back into the sea. The attack was fierce. German panzers managed to advance within 2,000 yards of the beachhead. Patton's 7th Army suffered 2,300 casualties in that single 24-hour period. It was a moment of true peril for the whole operation.
What saved them from disaster? What pulled them back from the brink?
Sheer firepower and logistical genius. The attack was broken only by a combination of concentrated American ground artillery firing every shell they had and overwhelming naval gunfire from Allied warships just offshore. That intense barrage decimated the attacking German formations. The Americans held the beachhead, but it was a sobering realization that German combat capability was still lethal.
This near-run thing really underscores a key takeaway for you, the listener, and one that points directly to the future success of overlords. The importance of logistics and American innovation. The survival of that beachhead and the ability to continue the fight relied heavily on two crucial U.S. technological developments.
The breakthroughs that fundamentally changed the nature of amphibious warfare. First, the tank landing ship, the LST. This vessel was designed specifically to run up onto a beach, drop a ramp, and just disgorge tanks, artillery, and trucks directly onto the sand.
It bypassed the need for a functioning port.
Exactly. And second, the often overlooked hero of the logistics effort, the amphibious 2- and 12-ton supply truck, the DUKW, or DUK.
The combination was revolutionary.
Totally. The DUKW could drive straight off the LST, through the water, and onto the beach, then just drive inland to deliver supplies. This meant Allied forces were no longer hostage to securing a major enemy-held harbor, which would inevitably be heavily damaged and mined to sustain a large invasion force. They could establish a beachhead almost anywhere.
And this lesson was immediately absorbed by Allied planners.
Absolutely. The British engineers saw the DUKW and LST in action and realized they could apply the same principles to create an entire floating harbor. That led directly to the concept and eventual execution of the Mulberry Harbor, the prefabricated floating port used to land vast amounts of supplies off the coast of France during overlords. Husky was more than just a fight. It was the essential logistical proving ground for the eventual victory in Europe.
Now, with the foothold secured, the fight on the ground accelerated, and with it, that command rivalry between Patton and Montgomery reached its peak. The British cleared the southeast corner quickly, but then ran into the heavily fortified German line in the rugged volcanic foothills of Mount Etna.
The geography was perfect for defense. The Germans were masters of utilizing terrain, and the British advance slowed to a painful crawl. Seeing his advance stall, Montgomery successfully lobbied General Alexander on July 13th, just 3 days after the landing, to shift the boundary between the 8th and 7th Armies.
And this boundary shift wasn't a minor adjustment, was it?
No, not at all. It essentially confirmed the 7th U.S. Army in that secondary role of flank protection. The British secured control of Highway 124, which was the primary road leading directly towards Messina. Patton was incandescent. He saw his command sidelined, his men relegated to a supportive role, while Monty prepared for the glory dash.
Patton's response, though, was classic blood and guts.
Mm-hmm.
He decided that if he couldn't follow Alexander's order to the letter, he would violate the spirit of it entirely. The only way to beat Montgomery was to redefine his own mission and capture Palermo, the capital and major port, first.
Patton just detested being second best. He secured Alexander's vague agreement for a reconnaissance toward the town of Agrigento, supposedly to secure his flank and open up a port. Once Agrigento fell quickly on July 15th, Patton simply broke away, driving 3 fast-moving divisions westward toward Palermo. He was acting independently, pushing the limits of his mandate, essentially running a parallel, separate campaign.
And the speed of this advance was incredible, primarily because the Italians were offering minimal resistance.
The troops Patton encountered, largely Italian coastal units, were just demoralized and overwhelmed. Palermo fell just 7 days later, on July 22nd. He captured 53,000 Italian soldiers and secured the entire western half of Sicily for the Allies. Patton secured his supply lines and established his own reputation for speed and daring. The sheer momentum he generated shocked the Axis high command.
And the news of Palermo's fall, arriving in Rome, was the match that lit the fuse of the fascist regime's collapse.
The timing was absolutely crucial, and the political triggers had reached a tipping point. King Victor Emmanuel III and the high military command had always been nervous allies of Hitler. They were utterly disgusted by Mussolini's incompetence and his inability to defend the homeland. But the final straw came just days before Palermo's fall.
That was the large-scale U.S. bombing raid on Rome.
Yes, on July 19th, the U.S. targeted railway marshalling yards, but the bombs fell wide, killing and wounding hundreds of Italian civilians in the historic city. This axe, the bombing of the capital, fueled this immense, widespread hostility toward Mussolini. The populace and the elites had just had enough.
So Mussolini, scrambling to retain power, summoned the fascist Grand Council on July 24th, trying to regain a vote of confidence.
And he failed spectacularly. After a 9-hour session, the council voted against him 19-7. The very next day, July 25th, the king dismissed and arrested Mussolini without a single shot being fired. The collapse of the regime was instantaneous and total. The Deuce, after 2 decades in power, was imprisoned.
Marshal Pietro Badoglio became the new prime minister. But he was in an impossible situation.
He was trapped. While he knew the war was lost and he needed to negotiate a surrender with the Allies, he couldn't antagonize the Germans, whose armies were still present all across Italy. So he made that famous, almost farcical announcement that the war continues at the side of our Germanic ally. But no one in Berlin or Washington believed him for a second. The Axis had just lost its most significant European partner.
And this political earthquake in Rome reverberated instantly across the Eastern Front, hitting Adolf Hitler at the most critical possible moment for his great summer offensive, Operation Citadel.
The scale of Operation Citadel, the German offensive aimed at destroying the Soviet Red Army in the Kursk salient, was the largest deployment of German armor in history. Since the disaster at Stalingrad, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had performed this brilliant operation, stabilizing the front and retaking Kharkov, creating this huge 120-mile wide, 90-mile deep bulge at Kursk. Hitler's generals all believed they had one last chance for a massive pincer movement to destroy the Soviet armies massed inside that salient.
But Hitler kept delaying the attack, and this indecision proved fatal.
Absolutely fatal. Citadel was originally scheduled for May 4th. Hitler postponed it repeatedly to mid-June, then early July. The reason, as our sources confirm, was explicitly the fear of an Anglo-American landing in the Mediterranean. He knew he couldn't commit his armored reserves to the east and simultaneously hold the south.
This delay wasn't just about troop placement, though, right? It was also tied to the introduction of Germany's new, powerful heavy tanks, the Panther and the Tiger.
That's the strategic nuance. Hitler believed these new tanks would guarantee victory, and he insisted on waiting until they were mass-produced and ready for deployment. His generals, like General Guderian, were desperate to launch the attack before the Soviets had time to fully prepare. Guderian famously questioned Hitler about the point of the attack, asking, "The entire world doesn't care if we capture Kursk or not." He argued that the strategic cost of losing their last major tank reserve was too high, regardless of success.
But Hitler waited until July 5th, giving the Red Army a crucial 2 months of warning time. And thanks in part to British intelligence passed via the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland and their own extensive networks, the Soviets knew precisely what was coming.
And they used those 2 months to turn the Kursk salient into the most formidable defensive complex ever constructed. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, created defenses up to 95 miles deep. We're not talking about simple trenches here. We're talking about 8 main defensive belts layered one upon the other, consisting of dense minefields, anti-tank ditches, fortified strongpoints, and immense concentrations of artillery.
So when the German attack finally launched on July 5th, they were running headlong into a prepared fortress.
And they faced overwhelming Soviet superiority. The Germans fielded 900,000 men and 3,000 tanks, including the impressive, if mechanically unreliable, new Tiger and Panther tanks. But the Red Army committed 1.3 million troops, 3,600 tanks, and 20,000 cannon. The Wehrmacht was heavily outnumbered, had lost the element of surprise, and faced defenses specifically designed to neutralize their new heavy tanks.
The battle raged for days. On the southern front, German tanks did manage to push a gap nearly 20 miles wide, but then came the climax on July 12th.
That was the largest tank engagement in military history, the Titanic clash at Prokhorovka. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was an industrial-scale slugfest. 2 full German and Soviet tank armies collided in a confined space. The fighting lasted 8 hours in blinding heat and choking dust, often reduced to point-blank range, just tank against tank. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed in that single day.
But while that battle was still raging, news reached Hitler at his headquarters that Operation Husky, the Anglo-American invasion of Sicily, had landed on July 10th.
This is the definitive strategic pivot. The news that Mussolini was collapsing and that the Allies had a massive beachhead in the Mediterranean made Hitler a very worried man, as our sources put it. He faced an immediate crisis in the south, coupled with the unexpected severity of the Soviet counterattacks in the north against Army Group Center.
So on July 13th, just 8 days into this massive high-stakes Citadel offensive, Hitler ordered a halt.
He just abruptly called off the operation, withdrawing the armored reserve divisions. His generals, including Manstein, were aghast. They were begging him to continue, arguing that they were close to breaking through. But Hitler needed to scrape together reserves to prevent the total collapse of the Axis in Italy. German casualties at Kursk had already reached 50,000 dead and wounded, and Hitler recognized the strategic priority had shifted violently southward.
This decision really confirms that Sicily was far more than a sideshow. It directly crippled Hitler's largest offensive of the entire war.
The consequence was immediate, permanent, and world-changing. The initiative lay forever with the Red Army. The Wehrmacht was forced to abandon the Kursk battlefields. Moscow celebrated the liberation of major cities like Orel and Belgorod in August, and Kharkov fell for the second and final time later that month. Hitler never again launched a major strategic offensive in the east. The war on the Eastern Front became a sustained German retreat, fundamentally secured by the success of Mincemeat and Husky.
Shifting back to Sicily, the end of Operation Husky was, in a way, kind of anticlimactic. Patton might have won his race to Palermo, but the final advance toward Messina found the Allies bogged down in brutal mountain fighting around Mount Etna.
It became a grinding war of attrition in those foothills. The German command, under General Hube, performed a masterful delaying action, using terrain, demolitions, and minefields to slow the Anglo-American forces. Patton finally entered Messina on August 17th, achieving his goal of beating Montgomery.
But the victory was hollow.
Completely hollow. And a remarkable feat of logistics in just 6 days and 7 nights. 40,000 Germans and over 60,000 Italians, along with the vast majority of their heavy weapons, had been skillfully evacuated across the narrow straits of Messina to the Italian mainland. Patton had won the race, but the prize trapping the Axis forces had escaped him.
Still, the immediate strategic gain was undeniable. The Mediterranean was now secured for Allied convoys, saving huge amounts of time and fuel by eliminating the need to sail all the way around Africa to reach the Suez Canal.
And while Sicily was wrapping up, on the same day Messina fell, August 17th, another vital operation was underway. The RAF launched a massive raid on the German secret weapons center at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast.
Right. This was the dark side of the strategic war.
Very much so. This was the response to Allied photo reconnaissance, which had confirmed Hitler was developing long-range rockets, the A-4, later known as the V-2, and the V-1 flying bomb.
The raid was vital. The RAF dropped 1,600 tons of bombs, destroying much of the site and killing several key scientists and engineers. The goal was to curb or at least delay these devastating secret weapon programs, which represented a potential new threat to Allied populations and supply ports.
So with Sicily secured, the immediate challenge was deciding what to do next, and that drove the strategic debate right back into the political arena.
And that debate took place almost simultaneously with the end of Husky at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec, beginning on August 17th. Churchill and Roosevelt met again to thrash out the next steps for Overlord the Pacific and the burgeoning tube alloys project, the atomic bomb. But Italy was the central point of contention.
The UK position remained very aggressive on the Italian front.
Churchill was determined to exploit the collapse of Mussolini.
He argued vehemently for deep, significant landings far up the Italian peninsula, far beyond the initial landing points. This is where he delivered his famous line, questioning the strategy of a slow northern advance. He said, "Why should we crawl up the leg like a harvest bug from the ankle upwards? Let us rather strike at the knee." He was advocating for a landing near Rome.
But the U.S. command still feared that resource drain. They insisted on constraints.
The primary constraint was air power. Eisenhower's planners calculated that Allied fighter cover needed to be guaranteed from bases in Sicily, and this limited the range of any deep landing operation. The ultimate compromise was Operation Avalanche, a landing plan for the Gulf of Salerno on the western coast. The objective was more modest than Rome: secure the major port of Naples, which was essential for supply, and try to trap Axis forces in southern Italy.
And adding urgency to this whole compromise was that hard deadline imposed by the Pacific Theater demands.
Yeah, many of the U.S. invasion craft, the very LSTs and DUKWs that were so vital in Sicily, were already scheduled for transfer to the Pacific. If Avalanche didn't happen soon, the resources just wouldn't be available for months. This placed immense pressure on the operational timeline, forcing a rapid, perhaps even a premature execution.
While the Allies planned their compromise, Hitler was not idle. Informed that the Badoglio government was actively seeking an armistice, he put Plan Axis into motion.
This German preparation was meticulous and brutal. Plan Axis dictated the immediate disarming of all Italian troops across the peninsula, the seizure of key military installations, and, crucially, the arrest of the king and the entire Badoglio government. The Germans intended to take full military control of Italy instantly upon any sign of defection.
And Hitler had not forgotten the fate of his friend, Mussolini.
No. Major Otto Skorzeny, a daring SS commando, was tasked with finding and rescuing the Deuce from his mountain prison. The Germans needed a fascist puppet leader to maintain some semblance of control and legitimacy in the occupied areas.
On September 3rd, the 4th anniversary of Britain declaring war on Germany, the first step onto the European mainland began with Operation Baytown.
This was Montgomery's 8th Army, crossing the Straits of Messina to land at Reggio di Calabria. They went in under heavy artillery cover, anticipating fierce resistance.
And what did they find?
Nothing. They met absolutely no resistance. 3 German stragglers and 3,000 friendly, surrendering Italians. Montgomery himself had been skeptical of the operation's value. He argued that a slow, grinding advance up the narrow toe of Italy, delayed by the inevitable destruction of bridges and tunnels, wouldn't draw German forces away from the main target further north. And he was proven right. The advance was delayed only by German rear guards carrying out demolition work, not by fighting.
That main effort, the decisive gamble, was Operation Avalanche, launched 6 days later on September 9th.
This involved 80,000 Allied troops, primarily the 5th U.S. Army under the ambitious General Mark Clark, landing in the Gulf of Salerno. This was the first major landing on the European mainland, and it was fraught with peril from the start.
Clark made a decision that nearly proved fatal. He dispensed with the usual preliminary aerial and naval bombardment.
It was a huge tactical gamble. Clark hoped to achieve complete surprise, believing the element of shock would compensate for the lack of preparation. This turned out to be an ill-advised calculation, born perhaps of overconfidence after the success of Husky.
And unfortunately for Clark, the German Field Marshal Kesselring, despite all the chaos of Plan Axis unfolding, had correctly guessed the main landing spot.
Kesselring was a shrewd commander. He concentrated 6 powerful German divisions, forming the German 10th Army under General von Wiedinghoff, in easy striking distance of the Salerno beaches. The Germans were prepared, dug in, and ready to meet the assault with overwhelming force.
So the resistance was immediately fierce.
In the American sector at Paestum, the 36th Texas Division went in without the softening effect of the pre-landing bombardment, and they suffered heavy casualties instantly. The Germans had artillery zeroed in on the beaches. While American Rangers and British commandos did manage to seize Salerno and secure key mountain passes, the entire beachhead was too wide for the 3 assault divisions, and the German response was immediate and coordinated.
And von Wiedinghoff's forces, composed of veteran combat teams, immediately exploited a growing gap between the British and American sectors.
This led directly to the critical crisis point between September 12th and 14th. The Germans launched these ferocious counterattacks. Their goal was simple: eliminate the beachhead entirely before Montgomery's slow-moving 8th Army could link up from the south. Fierce German assaults, using tanks and motorized infantry, almost succeeded in driving the Americans into the sea. This was far closer to disaster than the crisis they faced in Sicily.
How did they manage to hold on?
It came down to sheer, concentrated, overwhelming firepower, particularly from the sea. The Allied forces scraped together every available man, every artillery piece, and every shell they had. Crucially, the situation was saved by the tremendous volume of naval gunfire from the offshore Allied warships. They laid down a continuous, shattering bombardment that just decimated the German counterattacking forces. Reinforcements were rushed in, and the desperate German attack was finally broken.
It was a very, very close shave, proving that Clark's decision to forego the bombardment was a mistake that was paid for in blood.
The battle for Salerno was won by attrition and heavy metal support, not by surprise. On September 16th, Montgomery's 8th Army finally linked up with Clark's 5th Army, ending the immediate threat and securing the beachhead. Wiedinghoff, recognizing the failure of the counterattack, ordered a skillful withdrawal north, demonstrating the German ability to execute these costly delaying actions.
So Operation Avalanche succeeded, but at an immense cost, far higher than they anticipated.
Over 12,000 Allied casualties, including 2,000 dead and 3,500 missing, in just over a week of fighting. Naples, the crucial primary objective, was finally entered by the British 7th Armored Division on October 1, 1943. The Allies had their first solid foothold on the European mainland.
But the reality was grim. Churchill might have been right that Italy was the soft underbelly, but Field Marshal Kesselring had shown that the German military was more than capable of holding a costly, drawn-out line. The struggle for the Italian peninsula was only just beginning and would tie up Allied divisions for the rest of the war.
Kesselring's skillful retreat meant his forces lived to fight another day, slowing the advance up the Butte to a brutal mile-by-mile crawl through the mountains.
So let's bring all this together. We started this deep dive looking at the tentative steps taken between July and September 1943. And I think the central lesson is the profound, immediate, and world-altering interconnectedness of the various fronts.
Those 90 days from Husky to Salerno utterly transformed the war. Sicily was not a diversion. It was the crucial strategic pivot point. The invasion, fueled by the genius deception of mincemeat, forced Hitler to make the most consequential decision of the war, abandoning Operation Citadel, the largest German offensive ever conceived, and permanently handing the initiative to the Red Army.
And simultaneously, it toppled the fascist regime in Rome, fundamentally changing the political geography of Europe, even though the resulting strategic compromise at Salerno resulted in a near disaster and immensely high casualties due to that initial tactical error of dispensing with preparatory bombardment.
And this raises an important question that lingers over the entire war effort, and that is the singular power of psychological warfare. Operation Mincemeat worked because it exploited Hitler's existing paranoia about the Balkans. If Hitler had ignored the fake documents, if he had kept those elite panzer divisions in Sicily instead of scattering them to Sardinia and Greece, could Operation Husky have been stopped, potentially crippling the subsequent Allied timeline?
It's a powerful thought, one that really proves the old adage that the battle for information is often the most important battle of all. The fate of two massive armies at Kursk was decided by a lie placed on a dead man floating off the coast of Spain.
It just underscores how a single clever deception can alter the course of battle on two continents simultaneously, dictating the tempo and direction of global conflict.
And if you want to dive deeper into the tactics and stories of this crucial period in World War II and support the incredible work that goes into documenting these historical moments, remember you can purchase the War Stories merch. We've got custom designs reflecting the pivotal moments of 1943. Just click the shop link in the description to find our latest apparel and support the channel.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the tentative steps toward victory in 1943.
We'll see you next time.